the notes because Kim Clacker here, who is known to most of you probably, has done so much. If I don't read, I'm sure to miss something out. And Richard here, I don't know much about him anyway, so I'll have to read that out as well. So, Kim Clacker is a naval architect who established his first yacht design consultancy in 1970. He holds a master's degree and a PhD in sailing yacht performance and has published more than 30 scientific papers on naval architecture. He's sailed over 30,000 miles, including single-handed offshore passages and world championships. He has dragged anchor in 9 different countries. He is the author of the recently published e-book, Sailing Yacht Design, a guide for boat owners, crew and buyers, available from all online bookstores. I think we'll have a link to that later. Kim is of course also the editor of the WA Cruising Guide, which he does as a volunteer, and he's a previous cruising captain here and writes for Cruising Helmsman magazine, and in fact has an article on this subject in this month's edition. Now Richard, I don't really know very well, as I said, although I may have bought a Windrush sailboard from him a few decades back, because Richard Macfarlane is a mechanical engineer who established, with his brother, Windrush catamarans in the early 70s. He loves the ocean and enjoys most of the best cruising areas of the world. Richard has had a long-term interest in anchoring theory and techniques. His YouTube video, Anchoring: How to Stop Dragging and Be Secure, has been viewed 150,000 times. His ultimate hope is to reduce the number of yachts that drag into him in the popular bays of the Greek islands. So please welcome Kim Clacker and Richard Macfarlane presenting new developments in anchoring. Thank you guys.
Thank you. We're going to have trouble lifting up all that. Okay. What we're going to do here is I'm going to just very briefly introduce the topic. I'm going to hand over to Richard to do the first half, and then I'll do the second half. And I think the way we probably want to deal with questions is if there's a question about something you don't understand, then please ask at that time so that you don't end up flustered. But if it's a question or more a general comment about general things, if we can leave it till the end, because you might find your question is answered later on in the presentation anyway. Okay? So, this is what we're going to cover. The need for good anchor gear and what works, and Richard will be focusing on that particularly. Rope or chain, the big question mark as to which is best, whatever best means. And then I'll be looking at some anchoring trials that Richard and I did earlier on in the year, just off here. And from that, the possibility of perhaps a different way of anchoring has come up. And then finally, if we have time, I'll have a look at anchoring noises, which is a bit of a curiosity. So let's move on to Richard, and over to you.
Good evening all. Anchoring is difficult. I think everybody here has had problems anchoring at some stage, dragging. There might be some very clever or lucky ones that haven't, but I think most people have. So I'm just going to talk a little bit first of all about the importance of anchoring, secure anchoring, and then later about a few tips about how to be safer and more secure. Offshore cruising is really challenging. You're at anchor every night. Your boat is dependent upon its anchor every night. And you also, as you move around, you're going to a whole range of different seabeds, different types of bottom that affect your anchors, and also different weather as well. Anchor dragging can be an inconvenience or a major disaster. If you have a lot of anchoring problems, you can eventually lose confidence, and it sort of starts to dominate your life, wondering about your anchor, and you just plain don't enjoy your sailing. For charter boats, it's probably even worse, because a lot of charter boats have really inadequate anchors, and a lot of them have no means of determining how much chain you're putting down. So no wonder when people come back from chartering, they generally have anchor dragging stories and dramas. When we talk about our sailing, a lot of people ask us, have you been out in some really big storms? And they're hoping to hear sort of heroic stories of battling gigantic waves in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean or something. Actually, we tell them that anchoring problems are far worse than that. We're far more scared of anchoring problems. The sudden storm in the middle of the night, and you're close to the rocks or the beach, and all the boats around you are dragging or you're dragging, and everything's out of control. And actually, damage to your boat or the complete loss of your boat is far more likely with an anchoring situation than out in the ocean. We had our yacht Aida in Phuket for many years, and we just really loved it up there. We enjoyed the cruising, and we enjoyed the regattas.
Yes.
That's why you take it seriously. We enjoyed the regattas. This is the Bay Regatta that we really enjoyed. But we did the King's Cup in 2010, when a big storm demolished the fleet at Qatar Beach. The storm came in at 4 a.m. It was a pitch black night, rough, and there was absolute carnage. I was on my own, all my crew were ashore. I heard the crunching of fiberglass, the clash of rigging, and shouts from the boats being wrecked on the beach. We had a delta anchor and it held firm. It was 2 sizes overside sides, and I'd pulled it really hard to get it to dig into the bottom, and we were really secure. But at 5 a.m, a big red boat was dragging into me, and I had to wind out my anchor and drop it all on the bottom and leave. And it was just terrifying, a really crowded anchorage. And all the boats were weaving around, and it was just in the pitch black, finding my way out to the safety of the open sea. In the morning, it was just a horrible sight, with a lot of boats being smashed in the surf, people vainly trying to get them out, and just a lot of, there's 12 boats that were wrecked on the beach that day, and it was just so sad to see. But my point is, none of those boats should have dragged that night. It was certainly a rough night and unpleasant, but it wasn't that severe. The wind never went over 25 knots. If only people had taken it seriously, those boats wouldn't have dragged. This is the big red yacht that dragged into me that night. She was always drifting off, always dragging anchor. And I spoke to the owner. He didn't care. And this picture was taken 2 years later, when she finally dragged onto the rocks. And what a waste of a beautiful boat. Yachts are not always damaged when they drag. I think a few of you might remember about 25 years ago, a yacht dragged off Geograph Bay off the beach there and disappeared. She was spotted, found 5 months later halfway to South Africa. I think I'm right, was she called Windblown?
Windblown, yes.
Yes, a lovely name for a boat that drags anchor. So when you're cruising, you will encounter all the different difficult bottoms, all the different seabed types. And typically, the difficult ones, hard sand, where your anchor doesn't want to dig in, soft mud, where it doesn't want to grip, and you've got weed, or rocks, or coral. You're also subject, when you're cruising, to to what the weather gods throw at you. And there's generally nowhere safe to hide in these beautiful cruising grounds. There's nowhere safe to be. You're out at anchor and you've just got to put up with it. You will for sure come across conditions that are extremely challenging, and you need to be prepared for the worst. This is beautiful Macfarlane, one of our favourite destinations in Greece. We love going there. Macfarlane has very soft mud and it's really bad holding. And very often in the afternoon when the breeze comes in, a few yachts drag back and damage themselves on the quay. But it is bad holding, but we all still keep going there. So what we have to do is to make sure that our anchoring equipment is capable of working well in difficult conditions. So I'm going to look at ways to improve your safety and reduce your chances of dragging. There's always a range. If anchoring is difficult, there's always a few boats that drag and maybe get damaged or get into trouble. There's always a few boats that don't drag and that are secure. We want to be the boats that are secure, and so that you can sleep well at night or go ashore with confidence. So what size anchor should we be using? If you walk out on the jetties here, you see an awful lot of really small anchors, and they're just guaranteed to fail if they ever get in challenging conditions. The manufacturers are recommending anchors that are too small, and I'll just show you the delta chart. So let's look at the chart, that red line. You see the red line here. This is for a 40-foot yacht. And you can see at the top there, they're recommending a 10-kilogram anchor for a 40-foot yacht. Is that going to work? It's absurd. So the next size up is the 16-kilogram for our 40-foot yacht. Well, that's maybe good for a lunch stop. I wouldn't anchor overnight with a 16-kilogram anchor. But look down the chart, the 20 kilogram, they do not recommend a 20 kilogram. And they do not recommend a 25 kilogram. So this is extraordinary. And you think, well, why are they undersizing anchors? Well, I think it's just marketing. It's that if Delta can offer a cheaper product to anchor your 40-foot yacht in this case, they're going to get more business. And they do sell a lot of anchors, and a lot of people drag. I've actually communicated with Peter Smith, who invented the Rockner, and he agrees with me that Rockner make very good anchors. He agrees that they should be recommending bigger anchors for cruising yachts, but he says that would put them at a commercial disadvantage. And so all the anchor companies are competing with one another to reduce anchor sizes. So my advice is buy a bigger anchor, 1, 2 or 3 sizes bigger than recommended. Our 41-foot Beneteau in Thailand, we had a 25 kilogram Delta, and when it was suitably dug in, it kept us really safe. Was that extra 10 kilograms worth having on the bow of my boat? Absolutely. 10 kilograms to keep your boat safe. So what types of anchor should we use? The CQR and the Delta were pretty much the standard 10 or 15 years ago, but now they've been superseded. If you're choosing a new anchor and you look at the anchor tests, there's a lot of tests, and I find them really confusing results and conflicting results. One of the problems is that a proper anchor test should be testing on about 20 different seabed types to get the range. But the anchor tests are only testing on 1 or 2 types of bottom, and the result is that depending on where they test them, they get different results. If you're looking at anchor tests, always look for the failures. Don't look at the anchor that has the best results in one test. Always eliminate the ones that are giving bad results in some of the tests. An example of that is the Fortress here, the American Fortress. It's similar to the Danforth. That performs superbly in some tests, and the company advertises those good tests. But in other bottoms, it just doesn't work at all. In some of the tests, it just failed to drag. And I suspect it's hard sand where it just doesn't start to dig in. In Thailand, we had two anchors on our boat. We had the Delta, which is a good anchor, and it worked in most things, but it dragged in very soft mud. And then we had a CQR style that would drag on very hard sand. It just wouldn't start to grip. And so I had to carry two anchors, and every time we moved from one side of the island to the other, I had to change anchors, which was a real pain. The new generation anchors are really much more versatile and work over a really wide range of bottom types and much less likely to let you down. In Greece now, on our 45-foot Beneteau, we've got a 37-kilogram Rockner, still one or two sizes oversized, I'd like to say. If you buy one of the new generation anchors, you won't be disappointed. You've got the Rockner, the Manson or the Mantis. There's a few others that should be on the list, and they're all really good anchors. But just notice that all of these new anchors, they're all a concave shape, like a spade or a shovel. And they sort of really dig in, and the sand piles up on top of them. Notice that the previous anchors, all like the Delta and things, they're all a plough shape, facing down like this. And if you think about the design of a plough in agriculture, a plough is designed to part the soil with the minimum resistance for the tractor or the horse, whatever is pulling it. And so maybe this plough shape is not an ideal shape for an anchor. Okay, when you anchor, you must pull your anchor to test it. If you need to pull it at the load that is whatever you'll expect overnight, or if you're going ashore for whatever. So if you've got a folding prop on your boat, they don't work very well in reverse. I recommend pulling it full revs in reverse. And if you've got a fixed prop, probably sort of half revs or something. But it's just really important. If your anchor is going to let go under load, well, you want to find out before you go ashore. And I always enjoy swimming on my anchor, if you can. You learn an awful lot about how an anchor works, and you can see that it's dug in nicely, or you can see whether it's dragging or whatever. And it's just a lovely way to end the day, actually, going to swim on your anchor. I just found this picture here. I don't know what anchor it is, but it's dragging, isn't it? So if you see that, well, don't go to the pub until you've done something like that. And another trick we have is, you obviously can't anchor on weed, and we use Google Maps, the satellite view, if we're coming into an anchorage, to show us where the sand is and where the weed is. This is Thompson's Bay, and you can see a few good spots where you can put your anchor down. So if the light's not too good, then you can use Google Maps, and it really works. Okay, now the chain, or the rope that Kim will talk about, is a really, really important part of the of your anchoring system. So I'm just going to talk about the chain. So Kim, if you want to hold up, if you want to be the yacht at the end. So, and I'm just talking now about what is the typical situation where we anchor with all chain and no rope. Now, we need to be able to calculate how much chain to put out according to the depth. And you've got this scope multiplier. So you multiply the depth by a certain number in order to get how much chain to put out. The problem is that nobody can agree what the multiplier is. Some people say 3 times, or 6 times, or 9 times, whatever. And so it really just doesn't work very well. And I'll explain why that is. Is that this curve here, you get the same curve. Kim's putting a horizontal load on that, and you get the same curve for whatever depth of water you're in. So you might be here, or here, or here, but the curve's still the same shape for the same amount of load. And when you look at this, you can see the bottom part of the chain is really flat. So if you want to anchor in this much water, you probably need about 8 or 10 times the depth to give you enough chain because it's so flat. As you move into deeper and deeper water, it's getting more and more vertical, and you need to add proportionately less chain. And some anchor experts say that, okay, you use the scope formula, but you have to have a different multiplier according to your depth. Well, that's a bit complicated, really. So I'll show you a really simple way to do it. And I'm going to use this piece of string here, and this piece of string is going to represent what we're going to calculate. And you see it's got the marks on it that are the same length as on the chain. So what I'm suggesting is that you start off with a fixed length, and that fixed length I'm suggesting should be 15 meters, or a bit less if you're stopping for lunch or something, but say 15 meters. And then to the 15 meters, you add just trying to get my things to work. To the 15 meters, you add double the depth. So the formula that we use, so that's 15 meters along the bottom, and then double the depth up here. And you can see my blue marks there. You can see that the length for the anchor chain and the length for my piece of string, which is really easy to calculate, are fairly similar. So this formula, 15 meters plus double the depth, you can work it out mathematically, and it works out to be, it's an approximation, it's a reasonable approximation. More importantly, to do it mathematically, we actually do it in real life, and Claire and I, when we're anchoring, we always use this formula, and it's a really good starting number. But one thing with anchoring, you always add an extra 10 meters or more if it's rough. And Kim's going to go into this a bit, but the point about extra chain, it does 2 things. One is that it prevents you from lifting the anchor off the bottom, and also the extra chain reduces the load on the boat. It reduces the snatch load, so it's a sort of a win-win. But so 15 meters plus double the depth, and then if it gets rough, add extra 10 meters, and if you're really scared, another 10 meters.
Weight of the boat?
Look,
the heavier boat is full small.
Look, this formula, or any calculations, is based upon the weight of your chain and the weight of your boat. If you've got the correct chain for your boat, you know, as you get a bigger boat, you get heavier and heavier chain. And so if you keep within that, it sort of balances out. But if you've got a really heavy boat and a really light chain, well, this isn't going to work for you. But it's a sort of starting number. And, yeah.
Because it sounds pretty short, I think, to be honest. It sounds very short to me, you know.
Well, tell me, 10 meters, what anchor chain would you lose in 10 meters?
10 meters. 50 meters.
Oh, well, what about in 20 meters?
A lot. 100 meters.
Well, we don't have 100 meters of chain on our boat, and we anchor in 20 meters quite happily. Anyway, yeah. Okay, well, that's all from me, so I'll pass over to Kim.
Thanks, Richard. Right, now we're going to move on to sort of a development from that overview. first of all, we need to look at what we're trying to achieve with the anchor. And you've got 3 different situations. One is where you've got so much out there of line that a lot of the chain is lying on the seabed. That's fine, it's okay. And then you've got what you might call the optimum limit, where the pull on the anchor is still horizontal, but the chain is coming off the seabed almost immediately, and that's still fine. Because the main objective is to make sure you've got enough chain or rope that the pull on the anchor is never upwards pulling it out, it's only at a horizontal. And so that's what you don't want, is where the chain is already at an angle to the seabed at the anchor, and it's trying to pull the anchor out of the bed, out of the seabed. So, that's the ultimate, that's when everything's bar taut. And you hope you never reach that situation. But sometimes you do. Now, I'll explain this complicated graph in a minute, but the question of getting that angle of pull correct is sort of only half of it, because getting the angle of pull is good, but the other half is to try and minimize the loads, the snatch loads, the sudden jerking loads that you get when you're at anchor, either in waves or when there's strong gusty wind. And some people will say, well, the way you do it is the chain has got this nice curve, it's called a catenary, and it takes a lot of energy to pull that catenary straight, and that's how you reduce the peak loads, by absorbing the energy by having the curve or the catenary of the anchor chain having to be pulled straight. Other people say, well, that's okay, but once it's straight, you've really got a problem, because if you've got a straight anchor chain, not only are you pulling the anchor out, but there's no scope for absorbing any more energy. You get more load on it, and something's got to give. If you're lucky, the anchor drags. If you're not lucky, the anchor chain breaks. So why not use rope, which has got lots of stretch in it, and it will continue to absorb those peak loads, even when it's tight. So you've got the people who say, oh, you should only ever use all the chain, and you've got the other ones saying, no, you've got to add rope in there, and make it lots of rope to give you the stretch. And it was this that started the debate between Richard and I, and we said, well, okay, which is best? So I did some fairly unpleasant calculations and came up with this graph, where this is the amount of load on the anchor, on the horizontal axis, and then the amount of energy it can absorb is on the vertical axis. That's the amount of snatch loads it can absorb. And for chain, that's the blue line. For the low road tensions, you get more energy absorption with the chain trying to pull its curve out. But as you get more and more tension on the anchor road, then the rope starts to become better. And you'd think, well, this answers the question, doesn't it? No, because you don't know which end of the graph you're operating at. So we thought, well, how do we find out? And so we thought, well, let's go and measure the loads on the anchor. And that's what we did out in the pond here back in January. And Richard, being a clever mechanical engineer, designed and built this load cell, which measures the load of the anchor, and also you can plug an anemometer in, which measures the wind speed that's giving you the load, and records it all, and it does a wonderful job. And that's it attached on the bow of our boat. And these are the results we got. The horizontal axis is the scope, or the amount of chain we let out, and the vertical axis is the load that we measured. Now the scope here, if you're not happy with scope, 5 to 1, 6 to 1, we were actually in about, I think it was about 4 meters of water, something like that, out in the pond. So scope of 4 to 1 means we've got 4 times 4, 16 meters of chain out. Scope of 6 to 1 is 24 meters of chain. So what we found was quite interesting. The black line is the average load. This was in 23 knots of wind. And the average load was the same, pretty much, regardless of how much chain you put out. Kind of what you'd expect in a way. But the peak load, which is the red dotted line, that's the highest load we've measured over about, I think it's about a 10-minute period for each measurement. The peak loads are much higher if you don't put much chain out, which is really important because it's the peak loads that cause the anchor to drag. And so this is vindication of the need to put more and more chain out. But there's a point of diminishing returns, which is sort of what Richard is saying, is that when you're in deep water, you don't need proportionally as much chain. So that's what we found, and that's all kind of very interesting. But we still needed to know the answer to the question, whoops, where are we? Where's it gone that way? Oh, there we go. Come back, please. Thank you. We still didn't know which end of this we were at. And it turns out that you're usually on the left end. So let's just have a look at this. We found that the measurements we were taking showed that for most wind speeds up to 40 knots, 50 knots, you were on the left-hand side of the graph, which meant that chain was generally better. And the rope really only came into its own in what you might call extreme anchoring, the sort of conditions where you really desperately wish you weren't out there. Translate that through to here, and this is a way of working out how much chain you need based on those results. So you've got the amount of chain you need, the depth of water, and the wind speed at which you can be confident everything will be okay. And the curves, they're kind of useful lookup curves and everything else, and they're quite a useful guide if you happen to have it that printed out and stuck up on your bulkhead or something. It's not a bad way of doing things. But one thing that came out of all this was the actual numbers that we were measuring were way, way, way lower than the sort of numbers you see in the books predicting how much load there is. And a few reasons for that, but one of the main reasons is that most of the tables that you get for saying this is what the load on the anchor, this type of anchor is at this wind speed, they all come from the American Boat and Yachting Council tables. And those tables are not designed to tell you what the load on the anchor is, they're telling you what you should design the cleats and the anchor fittings to take. So there's a big safety factor. And if you use those tables to measure the anchor or to predict the anchor load, they're about 3 to 5 times too big. And we want to know what the actual anchor load is to know whether chain is better than rope. So we found that you've got to actually go out and measure the loads to know which is better, anchor, chain or rope. And so we wanted the chain pulling horizontally, but it doesn't always happen. Here's some results from other places. In the 20th century anchors, the ones that Richard showed, the Delta and the CQR, these are the loads that cause the anchor to drag. Delta was 675 kilos, CQR 310, not very good. Then you take the modern anchors, 1600 to 850. Huge difference. The modern anchors are so much better than the old ones. But to me, the interesting thing is, when we looked at the loads in 50 knots of wind for the anchor, you're only going to get 470 kilos of load. So in other words, if you've got the Delta, it's not going to drag. It's going to get close. If you haven't set it well, it might drag. The CQR will definitely drag. The load's 1.5 times its holding power. But for the 21st century anchors, you're nowhere near the holding power. You've got buckets to spare. It's fantastic. And so that's an interesting conclusion. So you might think, well, that's great. It means you just have a big anchor and you're going to be safe. And it's true. You are. But then I thought, well, let's just have a think about this. What happens if these anchors are not being pulled horizontally along the seabed, but they are being pulled up at an angle because you're using too short a scope or something like that? And these are the results of some tests that were done a few years ago. I'm sorry they're a bit small to read, I'll explain them to you. The bottom axis is the angle of pull from the horizontal. So as you're pulling horizontal, you're on the left-hand side of the curves, and if you're pulling at 30 degrees, you're on on the right-hand side. And then the vertical axis is how much load how much reduction in load you get. So you've got 100% of your holding power when you're horizontal, and then as you increase the angle of pull, you have less and less available holding power. So 50% of the holding power if you're pulling at 15 degrees. Now 15 degrees isn't a great deal. So if you've got your anchor being pulled up 15 degrees at the seabed, it's only got half its normal holding power. And the two different sets of curves are for two different types of seabed. The soft mud at the top and fine sand at the bottom, and each curve is for a different type of anchor. But the key to this, the important thing to get out of this, is that if we go up to say 10 or 15 degrees, we lose about half our holding power. Which, in the general scheme of things, is not good. But if we go back, if you lose half your holding power on the previous generation anchors, you've got a problem, you're going to drag. However, with the new generation anchors, you lose half your holding power, you've still got plenty left in reserve. And that made me just sort of think, well, that's an interesting possibility. What happens if we allow the angle of pull to be upwards? The modern anchors will allow that to happen without them coming undone. So if that's the case, why do we bother with chain? Why don't we just make it an all nylon rope so that it's got fantastic energy absorption? And as long as we're putting out 5 or 6 to 1 ratio, it's fine. If you do the sums, if you've got a 6 to 1 ratio is an angle pull of 11 degrees when it's bar taut. So if you're putting out, well, let's say 5 to 1, that's 12 degrees. So if you've got a 5 to 1 ratio of length of rope to depth, then when this is bar taut, it's still only pulling up at 12 degrees. So if you go back to that, 12 degrees is here, you've still got over half your available power. So it shouldn't drag. Now, yep.
What's the blue line on there that had
The blue line.
had the least reduction?
The blue line, yes, we all love one of those. That's an anchor, they called it a pivoting fluke.
Okay, that'd be that fortress, I think, wouldn't it?
It might be the fortress, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's good in these sorts of conditions, yeah. So, where was I? Yeah. One of the arguments against using rope is chafe, especially chafe on the seabed. And that's going to be a problem in this situation when the wind is light and the cable isn't stretched tight and some of it's going to be sitting on the seabed. Not good, especially if it's a limestone or a coral seabed. It's going to move around a bit, it's going to chafe and it'll break. So, why not make the first few meters buoyant line, spliced onto the normal nylon slightly sinking line? That way, when the wind is light, the first part of the rope is actually floating upwards, and then the nylon is in the water column, so it's not touching the seabed. Now, it's a radical idea, and all the conventional cruisers will say, nah, that won't work. And I'm not suggesting you go out and try this on a dark night in Thompson's Bay when the easterly's blowing, but it's worth thinking about. And what Richard and I are wanting to do is do some more trials, and this is one of the systems that we want to look at to see if it really will work. Because if it does work, then you've got some interesting advantages. Here, oh, it's gone off the top. Here's the weight advantage. On the left, I've got the all-chain option, and on the right, this radical new all-rope option. And you don't just look at the weight of the chain and the rope. That's only part of the whole system. You've got to look at the entire weight of the whole anchoring system. And I'm saying that if you've got, this is for a 40-footer, an anchor for all-chain, 25 kilos, Richard might sneer at that, but it's not bad. Let's suppose you say, okay, let's, with the all-rope option, let's make a really big anchor and put 42 kilos in there.
50.
Okay, 50. You bounce on 50. And then you chain is 145 kilos. That's the biggest component of the whole system. The rope is 15 kilos. You've got a snubber, you've got a windlass, you've got bow roller modifications, because if you put a bigger anchor on there, chances are it won't fit into the bow roller, so you've got to take it to the fabricator. So I've added a bit there. And so if you look at that, the total, instead of having 205 kilos of weight for your anchor system, with the new one, you've got 70 kilos. That's nice. 130 kilos off the bow. I like to be able to sail comfortably to windward without pitching, and that's going to help. Then if you look at the cost, this is again an interesting one. So they're just typical costs. I've added more because we've got a heavier anchor, so the anchor costs more. The chain, the rope, I've forgotten to put a price in there. Whoops. The rope is not much. It's about $300 or $400, I think, and snubber. But what's really interesting again is if we've got all rope and no chain, you don't need a windlass with an anchor gypsy. And maybe you could actually take the anchor rope back to the cockpit to an ordinary sheet winch that you've already got. Self-tailing, it's right next to the helm, you can control it easily, no going onto the foredeck. That sounds exciting. And if it works, you've saved yourself the cost of a windlass and a battery, which is at least £2,000. So, the cost difference is negligible if you still want a windlass. But if you don't want a windlass, you're going to save a couple of $1,000. So you're saving a lot of weight, definitely, and you might save some money too, if you don't want a windlass. And all that is because of two things. One is we've actually measured the loads and know what they are, instead of looking at these tables that are not being used properly. And secondly, the new generation of anchors have got so much in reserve that you can perhaps allow them to be pulled up at an angle after all. So that's the new idea, and I suspect it'll take 5 to 10 years before anything like that gets accepted, even if it is good. But if it does, you'll have heard about it here first. I'll just finish off if I've got time. How are we doing on time? Okay. When I was looking at this problem, where are we? And I suggested this to an anchoring guru on the East Coast called Jonathan Neves. Some of you might have read his work. He said, "Oh, interesting, you're just reinventing the wheel. Because way back before they had chain, they only ever had rope." I thought, "Oh, that's interesting. I wonder how long ago that was." So I did a bit of digging around, and the answer is chain was used. The first proof of chain being used is the Vikings. There's a boat in Denmark which has got chain, but the first time it was used regularly was in the 19th century when a British manufacturer worked out how to make chain reliably, and so the Royal Navy decided to use it. So it's only in the last 200 years that chain has been used. So this is not a new idea, nothing is new. But in the process of looking through all this stuff, I found a journal article called From Rope to Chain, Developments of Anchors in the Med, in a publication called The Mariner's Mirror, which I've never heard of before or since. And it's written by a lady called Honor Frost, who's a maritime historian. And she was looking at different anchors in the Mediterranean and went out with some fishermen who were fishing for sponge off Lebanon. And what they would do is they knew where the sponge beds were roughly, and they knew that the sponges were close to rock. And they wanted to make sure that they would be anchoring in the right place, so they're anchoring on rock, which is a funny thing to do, but that's what they wanted to do. They didn't want to anchor on sand because there was no sponge. And the way they would work out where they were, there are no depth sounders or anything like that, before they chose which anchor to use, and as a sand one or a rock one, or whether to stay in the sandy bit or go to the rock one, they would go down below and put their ear to the hull. And they would listen. And they would put the ear to the bottom. If they heard a swish, swish, it meant they were over sand, and a click, click meant they were over rock. And that's what they did. And I thought, what is all this about? And it's in the Mediterranean, so there's no swell, there's no currents. It's 40 metres of water, so that any waves aren't going to feel the seabed. And I thought, what's going on here? And luckily, I spent a fair bit of my professional life working with some of the world's best underwater acousticians, so I asked them, you know, phone a friend, it always works. And they come up with what might be the obvious answer, but they confirmed it, and it's snapping shrimp. How many of you know about snapping shrimp? One or two? Yeah. In this part of the world in particular, on certain nights especially, you can hear through the hull this crackling sound like a plastic bag being crinkled up. And that is a small animal called shrimp, and they're found in semi-tropical waters. And what's happening is the shrimp don't like to be on sand because they can be found by predators. They prefer the rock, and so that's when you get this crackly sound. And the other thing that happens is the sound they make bounces off the rock quite nicely, especially the high frequencies, so you hear that crackle. But when they're over sand, then the high frequency end of that sound gets absorbed by the sand, and it changes the sound that you get reflected back that you could hear. And so these Lebanese sponge fishermen knew all this, of course, and they could tell by the sound of the snapping shrimp and how it changed and its magnitude, whether it was sand or whether it was rock. Don't these things take you to strange places? Right, I think we're done. So it's time for, let me just check, I think we've covered everything. Yep. Oh, nearly covered everything. If you want to go to Richard's YouTube on anchoring, which I do recommend, you can, I put the link up there, not because you're all going to write it down, but because hopefully this is videoed and you can watch the video and then write it down. But you can Google Richard Macfarlane Anchor, you get to it, and Steve mentioned the book that's just come out, but you can Google Clacker Yacht Design and you'll get to the book as well, in all the bookstores and a few bad ones. Okay, so, questions? Yeah, right.
Yeah, I've a mate, he's driving professionally tugboats in North Queensland. And he actually thinks it's not so much it's the chain that poses the boat. You know? What do you think about this?
So the comment is that it's not so much the anchor that holds the boat, it's the chain. That's, well, Richard might want to comment on this. It's true.
That's what he said to me.
Yeah, a lot of people say that, and I would agree with that. I always used to say that if you've got your anchoring technique right, then you can use an old washing machine and it'll hold you there. But it's when it's not quite right that the problem lies. So the chain probably holds you a lot of the time, but not when the maximum loads are there, I'd suggest. Did you want to add anything, Richard?
Okay. Well, if you're going to use a washing machine, if you're going to suggest a washing machine, make sure it's a bloody big one.
Right, next question, right at the back there, is it Martin?
Yeah, there's Rock and Anchor actually have a website, actually has an interesting article about, you know, you get a smaller chain, buy a bigger anchor. So that kind of backs up what you're saying. But I'm interested in your idea of a all rope road and what would happen if the wind changes and how the anchors might reset. Because that's the big.
Yeah, the question is what happens to an anchor when the wind changes and the direction of pull changes and it maybe pulls out. It depends on the anchor as to how well it will reset, and I just happen to have a slide here. Let me just see. That's not that one, not that one. Resetting. These are the different sort of anchors, and this is their resetting power. Now, the trouble with anchor tests is they always do tests on different size anchors, so you can't pair the results directly. So what I've done is I've got 4 different sets of tests here. I've categorised the holding of the resettings either poor, P, average, A, or G for good. And these are all the different sorts of anchors they've tested. And you'll see, I think the most telling thing about this is how variable it is. You pick one particular anchor, I don't know, you've got the delta up there. It's average to good in that test, average to good in that test, average to poor in that test. And then you've got your, hang on, where are we? The fortress below it, it's good in that test, but it's poor in that one, which is what Richard was saying earlier. So, yes, resetting is a very important characteristic of an anchor. And if you're looking at different anchor tests, see if they've done tests on how well it resets. Regardless of whether it's rope or chain, this is a problem.
Yeah, I guess the thing is that would chain affect how well it resets by holding the anchor at a lower angle?
Right, so the chain will hopefully keep the pull horizontal as it resets. That's certainly possible, and one of the possible disadvantages of my all rope idea is how do you get the anchor to set in the first place? So we need to know how, if going to all rope makes it more difficult to get the anchor to dig in. Don't know the answer. Jeff?
Previous talks, or talk with you anyway, we talked about the number of anchors you have on a boat and what they're for. I personally carry a number of anchors for different types of bottoms, knowing that the primary is going to be used most of the time, but occasionally it's just not the right anchor.
Yeah, yeah.
So which anchor are you recommending as a primary versus secondary?
This is tertiary.
I'm glad you raised the point of how many anchors, because so many people say, which anchor should I carry? And it's the wrong question, isn't it? It's how many anchors. Yeah, Richard, you carry on with that one.
How big is your boat?
It's 30-foot waterline, 36-foot overall, but a lot of windage.
Okay. Well, that sort of answers the question. I think the problem is that if your boat is small enough that you can reasonably lift up an anchor out of the locker and shackle it on and put it over and change anchors, I think you have several different anchors for several different things. If you've got a bigger boat, if you're sort of over 45 foot and you're getting into anchors at 35 kilo, you know, ideally you've got 2 bow rollers and 2 windlasses or arrangements for 2 anchors. Most modern yachts don't, and you know, with our 45 footer we have 1 anchor. We've got a spare, but we have 1 anchor, and I hope I never have to change it. So I think the answer is that smaller boats can have multiple anchors, and that's probably a very good idea. I think bigger boats, you're kind of stuck with the one that's on the chain.
Yeah, if I can add to that, we got a 34-footer, and we ended up, when we were cruising longish distance, with 5 anchors. We had 1 main anchor, delta, another one for when you have to put 2 anchors out, a 3rd one was a fisherman for when it's rock and weed, a 4th one for the dinghy, and a 5th one to lend to friends who've lost their anchor. And we used every single one. Sorry, Jim.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Richard, for your talk. At the beginning, you talked about 20th century and 21st century anchors. Where do you put the Bruce anchor? Because it hasn't been mentioned on that chart either.
Yeah, where does the Bruce anchor sit, 21st or 20th century? It's definitely 20th century. It was designed in 1970, and it's got variable reports, and one of the things about the Bruce is that it was, as you might know, originally designed for offshore oil rigs in the North Sea, and the anchoring principles for very large anchors are completely different from yacht anchors. So when it was applied to yachts, it was with good intentions, but it depended on how you used it as to how good it was. Some people swear at them, some people swear by them, you know. It's definitely one of the lower holding power anchors compared with the modern generation.
Kim, one of the reasons why I'm still persisting with a delta is that when I look at Manson and Rockner and Starker, they've got the roll bar over them, which makes it incredibly difficult to store and so on. Have you got a comment on that?
No.
Fact of life, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. So you're either on the bow or you.
Yeah, I think is it Rockner have made a one without the roll bars?
Yes, the Vulcan.
Vulcan, thank you, that's it, yes.
And Sarker too.
Okay, and Sarker as well. So there are alternatives there.
And they roll back.
Yes.
Have you ever used a rope, two ropes was placed in corals? Yeah, and when it's coral heads.
Ah, okay.
What do you think about it?
Yeah, all right, there's a trick. Yeah. Any other questions? Any other questions? Oh, one at the back.
Yes, I have a question. For me, is this not good seamanship when you left the boat on anchor? Doesn't matter, you have the best anchor. Somebody must be on the boat and can take the anchor off. And all this, not a marina or somewhere on a mooring where you are safe. The wind can turn in and you go back. And I think it's not really good seamanship. You left the boat less anchor somewhere when you have more people, I'm a single-handed sailor. For me, it's not an option. Let the boat somewhere on an anchor. Doesn't matter how I think it's often changing a lot, and you cannot. I feel me not safe when my boat hanging on the anchor. I go on land. I feel not safe. Sorry.
Yeah, I can understand that feeling. I felt it myself as well. But Richard, you might want to add to that.
Oh, I'd just like to say that there's some beautiful restaurants ashore in the Greek islands. and you might like to discuss between me and the Admiral on my boat which of us is going to go ashore while the other one stays doing anchor watch. No, I think that the point that I've made is that if you feel unsafe, and Kim actually said this earlier on, he said if you feel unsafe leaving your boat at anchor, you need to take your anchoring more seriously. And if it means you have an anchor twice as big, and you have heavier chain, if that's what you have to do to get your boat at anchor. But basically, you have to get your boat to be safe at anchor. It's not a question of going ashore, it's a question of going to sleep at night as well. So just, if you're not happy with your boat, just buy a bigger anchor. They're not that expensive, they're a lot cheaper than a new boat.
Yeah, I've got some sympathy for that comment though, because it is, if you are on the boat and it's blowing at night and it's turned to lee shore, it is nasty and you need to be on the boat to sort the problem out. The fact of the matter is that most of us will not be operating at that high level of seamanship. It's true that we should do, but you go ashore to the restaurant, that's why you're cruising. And I'd just ask a question here. Those of you who go to Rottnest and anchor, if the conditions are dodgy, do you say, oh, when it gets sunset and the ranger's not around, I'll just go and pick up a mooring? Anybody do that? Yeah. You've no idea what's on the bottom of that mooring. Just because they're inspected doesn't mean it's any good. Every winter, half a dozen get up on the shore. You're putting your trust into a mooring that you've no idea is any good because you don't trust your anchor. And that's a shame. And I hope the things that Richard has said will help you to overcome that dilemma, because the mooring is almost certainly the worst option if you've got a good anchor. Jeff?
Yeah, okay. Real quick, I was happy to hear the question with regards to resetting, because that's the issue that we're talking about here. The modern anchors, the 21st century anchors, most of them reset within 2 lengths of their own anchor length. They're incredible how well they can reset. And that helps me sleep at night, Jim. So that's why I've got a modern anchor.
Yeah, so Jeff's point is that the modern anchors reset very quickly compared to the old ones, which is another advantage. One at the front again.
Yeah, so what wind speed would you set an anchor watch?
What wind speed would I set an anchor watch? It's not the wind speed, it's the circumstances. If you're
Thompson Bay, right?
Oh, well,
would you go to the restaurant on your anchor at 30 knots?
I would not anchor in Thompson's Bay overnight in the summer. The easterly blows in and it's revolting. Even if you don't drag, you just wish your hand weren't there. So, but if
where would you anchor?
I'd go to Stark Bay or Rocky Bay. But if you're on lee shore and you're close to a lee shore, I wouldn't even rely on an electronic alarm. I would be up in the cockpit ready to go. And if I could, I'd go before it all happened. Anchor watch is very important, so if you want to add to that with anchors.
Okay, I just share my experience. I have a 40-feet boat. She's a bit heavy. It's something like 15 tons. I have 25 kilos vulcan and 100 meters of 10-millimeter chain. And I feel safely in all weather conditions. It was somewhere in open anchorage near the Easter Island, up to 48 knots of the wind, but from the shore. Maybe hardest was 50-55 knots somewhere in Caribbean. Yeah, and near the Easter Island it was depths something like 20 meters with a bottom, but it's a lot of coral heads and sometimes chains around it, but it's okay. Mostly in this type of bottom, I use some fisherman buoys, it's round things, just hang it on the chain to lift it up from the corals.
All right.
You have to put something like 1 or 2 depths of chain, then after 1 or 2 depths, hang on the fisherman buoys. I have it 3. If it's enough, if it's not enough, I use fenders for this one. It's about corals. So I have seen a picture of your anchor, and I used a little bit different one. I don't know how it name, but the twist. Swivel, yeah. At first, I put maybe 20 centimeters of chain from anchor, then swivel, then other chain. Because I have experienced that when wind is changed, swivel try to, it's not allowed to anchor redragging again.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's interesting.
Yeah,
You said
so
you had.
I just share my experience.
Yeah, that's interesting. You said you had 100 meters of chain and
Yeah.
you anchored in 20 meters of water and it was okay.
Yeah, yeah. About yeah, and I have two lines from bow cleats.
Yeah.
To absorb with the hooks.
Yeah,
It's
the snubber.
it's a snubber.
I'm just trying to think how that.
Sounds like maybe 4 or 5 meters.
Yeah. I just want to see how that works with Richard's simple formula of 15 meters plus twice the depth. So if you're in 20 meters of water, that means you'd need 55 meters of chain, whereas you actually wanted 100 meters. Well, you had 100 meters.
Yeah, but so sometimes in it depends on weather conditions.
Yeah.
Because when I was in Mexico, and it was up to 50-55 knots, but early we expect a hurricane. We drop anchor in 5 meters, and I put maybe 80 meters of chain. And, I was ready to do something else. Because,
Sorry. One of the things that hasn't come up here is the sea conditions. You've talked about wind and so on, but I've found my worst anchoring experiences have been when there's a really large chop and swell, and you know, that's really put a big load on the bow and so on. So have you looked at that? Is there any comments on that?
Yeah, I have looked at that, and it's extremely difficult to calculate the loads due to waves. Spent too many years of my professional life trying to do that. And it depends. If you actually anchor in open ocean, which is a pretty dumb thing to do, but sometimes you have to, then the loads due to the waves can be at least as big, if not bigger, than the loads due to a strong wind. But for most of the places where we anchor to avoid a gale, they're usually reasonably sheltered. They haven't got the full ocean swell coming in. And in those circumstances, so we're talking about, let's say, Thompson's when there's a bit of west in the wind, Rockingham unless there's a northerly, places where it can be choppy but not revolting, then the division up of the loads between wind, wave and current it's usually about 80% wind, 15% waves and 5% current. That's a sort of 2 to 3 knot current, which is pretty severe. So if you're in what you might call a semi-sheltered natural anchorage, then the wave loads are not that much. But obviously if you get caught out and you've got the full force of the waves coming in, then yeah, you're going to be in deep strife. And Richard.
One thing that makes an enormous difference to waves, particularly a swell, is the depth of the water. And if you look at how much energy, and Kim was talking about energy, how much energy in deep water, your anchor chain can take a lot of energy from the swell as a boat surging backwards and forwards. Your anchor chain can just absorb a lot of energy in deeper water. And in shallow water, it's just tight, it can't move. And so there's 2 points, is that if there's a swell or if it's rough, going into deeper water makes a lot of difference because the swell is less peaky in deep water, and also there's a lot more absorption in the chain. So depth makes a lot of difference. And in very shallow water, you just simply can't. This is where Kim's talking about lope is better, but with chain, in shallow water, there's just no give to it, and so that gets to be a real problem. So I tend to, I've just sort of developed the habit of just actually anchoring in deeper water a lot more. And
yeah, I think thanks very much, Kim and Richard. We should let these guys off the hook. Very interesting discussion. And thanks for sharing and doing that, taking the effort to do all this research and sharing us with us. It's amazing to sort of think that anchoring can still advance in this day and age even. So good on you guys for sharing it with us. We'd like to give you a little token of our thanks from everybody. So Kim. Thank you. Richard. And please join us for a drink and further talk. Yeah, cheers, everybody.